Looks like we're live. Okay, so again, this is pre-recorded. I just want to welcome everybody to Memento Mori Inc. podcast. Tonight we have Dacre Stoker with us, and we have Dr. Chris McCauley. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm going to start with Chris only because I know Chris is limited on time today. Chris, would you tell us a little bit about yourself? And because Chris's resume is ridiculous, by the way. So if you can get it all in the time before you have to leave, that would be great.
Okay, yeah. So I'm the co-creator, along with my good friend Dacre Stoker, of the Stokerverse. If you don't know what the Stokerverse is, it is a unified horror universe which has been inspired by the writings of Bram Stoker. And Dacre and I are bringing Bram Stoker into the modern arena with books, novels, audios, comic books, tabletop games, video games, and all sorts. Apart from that, I'm also the co-creator of Dark Legacies, which is a science fiction franchise, which is in novels, comics, tabletop games, video games, and that's along with Babylon 5's Claudia Christian and a whole host of actors from Babylon 5, Star Trek, and Terminator. Speaking of Terminator, I also write for the Terminator franchise. So I have written canon short stories for Studio Canal. So they're all officially canon, and I was involved in the Terminator 40th anniversary book, which is being released with some brand new stories. I write for Star Trek. I'm on the front cover of Star Trek magazine this month. So if you just have a look on the top left, if you get it, Star Trek, I think it's Star Trek Encounters, it's called, or Explorer. I am there. I also write for television, film, and video games.
Awesome. And then, of course, Dacre, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your esteemed lineage.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be born into a well-known family in the horror genre. Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, is my great-grand-uncle. That translation into genealogy, he was one of 7 kids. His youngest brother's my great-grandfather. And about 15 years ago, I got interested, putting my teaching and coaching career on hold to get involved in writing with a number of different co-authors. They've all been in the sort of the Stoker world. With Ian Holt, Dracula the Undead became an international bestseller, as did Dracula with J.D. Barker, a prequel to Dracula. And I also found Bram Stoker's Lost Journal, which was a discovery during my research. And that was Bram's actual journal. And then I met Chris McCauley. And as you have heard, very successful Stokerverse that we have created together and branched out using all these different things, research that I found, Chris's creativity, things that were left out of the novel, things in Bram's life people didn't know too much about. We've introduced back into games and stories. And it's not just Dracula. We've touched on and are in the process of touching on other elements of Bram's life, some of his other writing, and modernizing that in graphic novels, games, and so on. So it's really, sort of the whole idea of making the creator of Dracula at least getting close to his creation, and expanding his legacy to fans that really don't know too much about him.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Pixie, I'm going to let you ask your question because you did have a question that I thought was pretty good, because we did discuss this a little bit with Dacre a while back, but since we brought you on and we started discussing Dacre and this world, you brought up a really good question. So I want to let you go ahead and start it off.
Yes. I am a historian myself and a horror aficionado, and I was wondering if Bram Stoker was aware through his mother and his nanny of the Duraga Dua, the female vampire of Whitmore.
Yeah.
Whitmore.
So you've sort of tipped your hat, because you obviously haven't read, and I don't mean this with lack of respect. J.D. Barker and I
No, I have
included
not read it.
that vampire in that very story because we
Ah,
don't have proof, Pixie. What we have is circumstantial evidence, and so what Bram didn't write an autobiography. He spent all of his life, doing things for other people. He was very aware of things around him, and that I got from his 300-page journal that I found. So my instinct, collecting lots of circumstantial evidence, was that he was very aware of Irish folklore and mythology. But nowhere did he write down, yeah, I'm aware of Derdu, or I'm aware of Abertacht, or any of these other things that Chris brings to my attention, which is really canon when it comes to Irish folklore, superstition, and myth. But he has included some of those things in his other stories, so it would sort of make sense to us that he was aware of it. But no written proof. There is 125 pages of Dracula notes. Nowhere in there does it say, yeah, when I was a little boy, I was very aware of all this stuff. And the reason is he doesn't have to write those things down. He was organizing his thoughts based on things he pulled out of research books, timing everything right, train schedules, maps, all that stuff. The things that were already in his consciousness, he didn't need to write down. That's why there's all this debate about how Irish is Dracula, how Irish is Bram's writing, and it just requires people to do a little homework and read some of the other stuff and put the pieces of the puzzle together. So I'm really glad you asked that. I didn't mean to be cheeky, but if you are interested
no
in that,
offense.
well, it's I think it was.
I can't read everything.
No, I get it. But because you brought it up, this is a plug, a shameless plug. Now you should read it, because I think we integrated that
Mm-hmm.
Oh no.
into the story in a brilliant way, using the nanny and Dracula's guest and weaving the fact and fiction and superstition together. I think you'll like it if you ever, and it's also on Audible if you don't have the time to read.
Yeah,
I
so
always find time to read.
yes, she does. She's
Don't have a
always
lot of
reading
money to
something.
buy new books, so.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off with her because of that, because there are some people who have not read it, but it also kind of bridges the gap between you and Chris, because I think Chris also has a little bit of knowledge, just a little bit of the Irish portion in folklore.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. So I wanted to, sort of, kind of bridge that together, because I know that Chris brought a lot to the table as well, and your research, because something that all of us have in common on this is that we are, we could probably get lost in a museum if they let us, so bringing together Chris's knowledge of folklore with Dacre's love for education and museums and things like that, I think is amazing. So Chris, tell us a little bit about when you got with Dacre, how you guys brought those two things together.
Well, we looked at Dracula. We were going to do the continuation of Dracula, and we looked at it and we thought, well, what could we combine with Dracula? And we look. The White Worm is another significant Bram Stoker story. Not as well received as Dracula, but there are some fascinating Irish myths that are tied in there. So the origin of Halloween comes from the worship of this serpent god, Croncrioch, and children were sacrificed, and there was all sorts of horrible things that happened. The Irish, for the Irish pagans, what they did. Thankfully, St. Patrick came down and removed that worship of the serpent. There's no snakes in Ireland, never have been. But what he did was he removed the worship of Croncrioch, that the White Worm's based on. So we integrated that into Dracula Return. Mm. And I think that was one of the most significant things. There we go, Dracula Return, Cult of the White Worm, issue 1.
Yes, I have that one. It's beautiful. It is so beautiful. Yes.
And we did that in issue 2. There's Carmilla. There's Dracula's niece Carmilla there. So that was part of what we did. Now we had written earlier things. We had looked at Bram Stoker's The Squaw, which we retitled The Virgins of Brias, and we looked at The Virgin of Nuremberg, The Iron Maiden. Dacre came up with this great idea that we would actually integrate Bram Stoker and his wife Florence into the story, because Bram and Florence's honeymoon was in Nuremberg, and Nuremberg was very important because that was really where the Order of the Dragon was conferred upon Vlad II. So we have little Easter eggs like that in the actual graphic novel too. So we come together very well. We come up with ideas, and we try and make everything as authentic as possible. But also, we're not scared to have fun with things.
Yeah.
Which I think is important for the creativity side of it. There is a Stokerverse beer. This is what I'm sipping on at the minute, and it comes in a non-alcoholic variety.
Oh, okay.
So this is the non-alcoholic variety that I'm sipping
Excellent.
on at the minute. But yes, it's a limit. It was a limited release around Halloween, and I think I've got like three or four bottles left. So like we have fun with the whole thing. We have fun with the franchise. You know, we're doing a children's tabletop game called Dr. Frankendice Monster Mayhem, and that's a fun family tabletop game. So although, you know, the prime Stokerverse is quite dark and gothic, we understand that, you know, there are other business opportunities out there and other ways to extend the franchise in a fun way.
Hey, Lisa, here's one, and again, to tap into Chris's resources. But for years, there was, I didn't understand a piece of the one book that Bram wrote in Ireland, The Snake's Pass.
Yeah.
And Chris really helped me get some of the key factors that were mentioned in the story. So recently, I was on a year and a half ago, I was on a tour with some people, these literary tours in Ireland. And Chris, we were down near the cliffs of Moher.
Yeah.
And I met this guy in a pub.
Go figure.
Yeah, but we all went in because we were taking a tour of one of these places that doesn't farm salmon, actually catches the wild salmon and then smokes them and sends them all over the world. And this guy wanted to meet us, and his pub was right next door. He owned the salmon thing. And so he started chatting as they do, and it was like going a mile a minute, and it was hard to understand him. And so one of the guys on the tour started videoing it, and it was freaking hilarious. But what he was getting at was Bram Stoker traveled all over Ireland when he became the inspector of the clerks of petty sessions all over Ireland. And he would travel by train, by carriage. And Chris and I was like, oh my God, that's where he gets the Jonathan Harker thing from.
Yes, I was going to say, yes.
That's that feeling he has, leaving the city, leaving Dublin, going out in the countryside and having to inspect people. So he's not particularly well received. You know, it's a little bit on edge, a little bit like Harker going to Transylvania and having to consummate all the land transactions with the Count.
Right.
But what I'm getting at is this guy starts talking about that. And I didn't realize, you know, at first glance, he was just some, you know, kind of scruffy guy tilting back the beers. But he started explaining how when Bram was the inspector, he came into the pubs, which you're really not supposed to when you're on duty. But when you're off duty, it's okay because you get to know what's going on in the area.
Yeah.
And this is where, and Chris, I'm going to ask you this. And it was really confusing to me. And the guy goes, oh, yeah, the shifting bog, the shifting bog, the shifting bog. And I'm going, what the hell is a shifting bog? And our tour guide was showing us the steep mountain slopes and also the shale type rocks in the area. And you know, they talk about geology and the way the towns are. And it was like, what is the guy getting at? And finally, I get back. Chris, you want to tell everybody what a shifting bog is?
Yeah, there's like moving bogs. There's one near Clara, and essentially it's one of these things that it's a phenomena that you've got this whole thing where there's a river and the river gets stopped up, and then it starts this mass in motion, and that's what the bog is. So the bog's like this peat clay. So we would in Ireland we call it turf. So you would take the peat and you would burn it, and that's what you would use. But you have to go and dig in the bog to get the peat. So that's what a bog is, firstly. And a shifting bog is whenever a river gets sort of stopped up and it starts to shift, it starts to move. Now, in those bogs were where the first Irish vampires came from. So if you can just imagine, you get stuck like clay, like dogs, and then these hands start to clamber up your body, and they pull you down, and then they do God knows what to you.
And these are where they find these preserved bodies and these and butter that's been wrapped up in cloth for like 500 years. So the properties of them are interesting. And this particular shifting bog in this area, and then I went back and read The Snake's Pass. there was magical properties, as Chris is talking about, and one was on a hillside. And in our language over here, we don't have the real bogs like Chris, but it created a landslide and it took out a village. But in the story, Bram took a real shifting bog that slid down the hill, took out people, innocent people, and realized there was some sort of a magical bad guy that controlled this. So he was so what Bram was a master of, and this is what Chris and I do, is we take what we perceive as reality, real history, and then fictionalize it so that people, just like Dracula and many other stories Bram's written, don't know what's fact and what's fiction. And so you get caught up in the whole thing. Is it superstition? Is it folklore? Or is it truth? And then it doesn't matter. It's just a hell of a good story.
Exactly. Yeah.
We'd sort of also touch on the fact that Bram didn't just write Dracula, right? This is the other thing that Dacre and I are we're very hot on, right? Because the Stokerverse, okay, we have Dracula as a prime feature. But I do remember in a previous incarnation of your magazine, Lisa, that Dacre and I provided the prequel story to Jewel of Seven Stars that Bram Stoker wrote, which was a mummy story. It was, you know, it's a really good story. And I think it was made into a film as well, Dacre. I think it was made into a Hammer film. Christopher Lee does a voiceover for it. I don't think he's actually in it, but he does the introduction. It's come out in the 70s. It's a brilliant book, and it's something that we have integrated into the video games, into the games, into Dracula as well, into our audio dramas. So Claudia Christian actually plays a thief character. She's part of a thieves guild in the Victorian era, and she uncovers the mystery behind Carfax Abbey and why Dracula wants Carfax Abbey. And Dacre and I brought in plot elements from Jewel of Seven Stars into that. And Jewel of Seven Stars is cosmic horror, you know, so he was doing cosmic horror slightly before Lovecraft became a thing. But it is that whole cosmic emptiness that's there. And when the stars align, you don't know what's going to happen. So another great book for people to check out.
Donelle, you had a question?
Well, I mean, we're talking about some of the works that Bram Stoker had done. The Squaw, for one. I recently discovered one, and I have not had a chance to read it, but I do have it in my Kindle, in my reading list, called The Jewel of Seven Stars.
That's what he was just talking about.
Is that what that was called?
Yeah.
Okay. So then I'm squirreling. I am so sorry. I just spent 2 weeks homeschooling my grandchildren. Today was the last day I had to do anything with them. I love them dearly, but
your timing is great because Chris just endorsed it. You've got it. So the next time we get together, you can give the book report.
I will definitely be reading that because it's just homeschooling my grandchildren was great.
So,
and then I know that you guys also did like little audio dramas, right? So the audio dramas, I got on those right away when Chris was telling about those. They're very short. They're very short and very well acted out and produced. I love those because, you know, nowadays short stories are really big and you have like your little serials like Bella became really big. So you guys kind of like jumped on that right at a really good time. Do you plan on doing any more with that?
Yeah, they're more recorded. We're just waiting for the publisher to bring them out.
Okay. Gotcha.
So it's I don't know if you know Sam Underhill, her professional name. She's recorded a few more, so we have more.
Oh, excellent! Yeah.
So we actually have strangely enough, we have a prequel to the Phantom of the Opera that's been recorded. It's one of those things because we're dipping into monster mythologies. We did Terror Under the Rue Morgue, so we've already done Parisian sort of horror and brought that into the Stokerverse. And we actually did the prequel. We recorded the prequel to the Jewel of Seven Stars, and it's an audio as well. It's out at the minute, but I think there's about 6 more that have been recorded. We're just waiting. We're just waiting for the publisher really to put them out.
So I was concerned. I was like, listen, I need some more of these because they were really nice to just kind of like, if I was on break or something, I would listen to kind of get me into the mood. It was just so well produced, and I love, just it was like the old radio shows, kind of sit down and just have a little break in what's going on.
it's exactly how Decker and I designed them, because
Yeah.
a lot of audiobooks are like 14 hours. And
Yes.
the thing is that by the time you get back to them, and it's okay if you're traveling in the car or something, but
Yeah.
I've been noticing more and more people like a 20 minutes short story, a 15-minute short story,
Right.
it reasonably priced. You go, you buy it, and you listen to it, and you enjoy the story, and you're left wanting more. Voices of Dracula was actually that as well. Voices of Dracula was the
Yes.
first one that Decker and I did, and we had an all-star cast with that. But they were 20-minute audio pieces that added up, I think, to 70
They're
minutes or 80
fantastic.
minutes.
If you guys have not listened to it, grab it, because they are so fantastic. It was such a great thing to listen to after we did the interview and everything. And then, of course, like you said, you gave us that little prequel to everything that was going on. It was just the perfect for me, like coming out of that. It was like I didn't want to stop. So it was like, it's just sort of that perfect thing to kind of like, bring you out of it very slowly kind of thing. There's no shock involved in, now I'm done talking with them, it's over. But yeah, it was really fantastic. I'm glad you guys are going to do some more with it.
I've got to go.
Okay.
Why I've been growing this horrendous beard. Most people know that, and it's driving me nuts. But I go and become Santa, so I do charity things. I'm going to kids' hospital and doing that sort of stuff. So I have to go now and whiten my hair and whiten the beard and get into the suit. Go.
Just
but it looks so cool.
It's not scary Santa. It's
actually, it's not. It's not Krampus. It's not anything like that. Yeah,
it's not. And I'll give a plug to my kids' Christmas book.
Yes,
Enchanted Tales. It's out. Cosby Media have published it last year. It's part of a kids range, seasonal kids range. I have a Halloween one as well called Candy Trails and Pumpkin Tales. And
I love it.
You can get the two together. I have a big thing about trying to get kids who are reluctant readers. I want them to be reading more. So I'm finding my feet as a kids author. I've done a couple of young adult biographies that will be coming out as well. So no, I don't just do scary stuff. I do other things as well. But I've got to go.
Yes.
Thanks very much for having me on. And Decker, I'll catch you soon, mate. I'll catch you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. All right, here we go.
Half is Santa,
I know. It's crazy. So I know there was a couple of things that we did want to touch on. So let's go into the books that Bram used for the Dracula research. So they've been discovered in the London Library recently, 2018, that you helped verify that as well. And they curiously have the marks in the margins indicating what caught Bram's eye, like volcanoes, home of the devil, vampires, trances, ghosts, and more. So go ahead and talk to us about that.
So yeah, this it all happened. The discovery was initially made back in like 2018, 19, and the head of the London Library contacted me and said, listen, we don't have records because bombing during World War II, burned stuff, so we don't know for sure. But he was a big Dracula fan. I knew about him, and while I was working on my Dracula annotated for the 120th anniversary with Robert 18 Pasang, who had also published the Dracula notes, Philip Spedding from the London Library contacted Robert and said, look, I think I'm onto something. Can I use you guys as a resource? At the back of Bram Stoker's notes that live in the Philadelphia Rosenbach Museum, Bram, like a student, listed his resources. And those books were, this guy Philip found them. He walked around his museum, his library, which is like a museum, with this list and started looking for books in general circulation. And he was pushing this cart and he was like, here's one, here's two. And he got like 26 books out of general circulation. Now, unlike libraries that we all grew up with, where you have the little sleeve in the back with the card and the stamps and date, they didn't have any of that because it was a private library. What you do is you take the book out of the shelf and you'd go to the person up front. They'd write the name of the book down. They'd write Mr. Stoker and the date. And you've got to have it back in a week. So there really wasn't that accountability to Uncle Bram having these books. But Philip found, as he leafed through them, these rather strange pencil marks. And sometimes there was little codes next to words or paragraphs. So he wanted to know, did I know of any other books Bram might have had that he had similar markings? And I had at the time in my possession from doing this this book with Robert, the one edition of Dracula from 1897 that Bram was given by his publisher to reduce the word count by 30,000 words to make the first paperback abridged edition in 1901. So Bram had about a year to cross out with pencils and make bridge words and all kinds of notes in a first edition Dracula. Now, there was obviously no computers and no type. You could have a typewriter, but that's not going to do you any good.
Right.
What you want to do is basically cut and paste. So he did that all by hand. And I was looking through that book, and he was telling me, yeah, I saw some of these little lines. I see NB. I see these little squares with a circle in it. And funnily enough, some of these things were the same. And then Philip discovered that Noel Stoker, Bram's son, had donated, after Bram died, 2 books of Bram's to the library, London Library. And sure enough, this is proof, because those books had this very similar markings in them. So we get 2 independent sources, the son, myself, years apart, and these other books. And it's no mystery that the words and the passages that Bram made notation on corresponded to the notes in the Rosenbach Museum.
Right.
Volcanoes were once thought to be created by subterranean gods. The devil resides here. Superstitions about trance walk, all the stuff where Bram's talking about Lucy walking in a trance across Whitby to go to Count Dracula. So this made total sense, as well as books by Charles Bonner, Andrew Cross, that had descriptions of all the places in Romania, the clothing, the Literwagen, the cities, the places Bram never went to. The maps, the actual map that Bram used when he plotted out the action in Dracula, and the coordinates were sitting in Philadelphia in his notebook, 25 3/4 and 47. And you cross-reference that to a map, in another continent, and boom, you land right in the place near the Borgo Pass where his fictional castle was. And it happened to be a volcano. So I was able to put these pieces of this puzzle together and verify beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Bram that did it, based on the other books he did, but also the subject matter, guys and gals, that he was looking for a devil incarnate. The location of the devil is in a volcano, the portals to hell. And he found this thing in Transylvania, and he found information about Vlad Dracula in Wallachia, but moved him up to Transylvania, the next door province, because of another book by a Scottish lady, Emily Gerard, who wrote all about vampires and how to kill them. So this was sort of a culmination, like the final piece between the deleted ending of Dracula in Seattle, Washington, owned by Paul Allen, the Rosenbach Museum notes, the London Library, and different pieces that Bram had been thinking of in his notes, and they all just sort of came together perfectly.
Right. And I did read another interview that you did where somebody had asked you, like, hey, do you believe in the supernatural? Do you believe in ghosts? And you had come to or started talking about a feeling that you had when you were doing all your research, that you sort of had, him there, and it was sort of that feeling that you have this,
Hairs
this
on the back of your neck.
approval. Like he's still doing it now. He's like, oh my gosh, so
when I sit there, and I've done this in a number of places, and probably the spookiest was really in Marsh's library in Ireland, which apparently is haunted by the guy who founded its daughter. And so I'm there with my notes, getting ready to do a lecture later in the day, and they've actually shown me the table that they knew was there when Bram was there in 1866, and they pulled out the very same books, that the same thing. Bram had asked for this book, called up the book, and the person who was the registrar wrote the name of the book and the date, and then crossed it out when Bram handed it back. They pull out this book, and I'm leafing through it, and it's all about geography in Eastern Europe. It's all about religious conflict, and boom, sure enough, it becomes one more source that nobody ever knew about, that Bram didn't write down his notes because he didn't start doing Dracula for another 25 years, but it mentions Dracula and his brother and the Ottomans and Transylvania. So it's like, oh my God, I just found, the first thing that Bram probably, fell
Yeah.
upon. And it was like, that this is a cool feeling. I start looking around going, this is maybe the genesis point. This
Yeah.
is the one. Now, just because he didn't write it down doesn't mean he wasn't aware of it, but I just got that feeling of that sort of approval feeling that, yeah, man, you're onto something. Keep going. It's nice that somebody in our family is doing this, and
Yeah.
nobody has ever found this before, but keep going. You're on the right track.
Tixie, did you have a question? I'm sorry. She was nope. Okay. So the other question I had for you is, because you're doing all this research and you're finding all these things, have you ever found anything else of Bram's that, maybe he had written that you kind of stumbled upon in, an old chest in the house or something like that? Because I know that, things happen. Families, shift things around. Hey, this was Uncle so and so's, this was Grandpa's, this was grandmother's, and some people are like, what am I going to do with this? And it sort of feels like you got trunks full of things, and nobody wants to be a hoarder, so they're getting rid of it. Have you stumbled upon things like that? Because I'm sure when he wrote Dracula at the time, like I wrote books and you wrote books, do we think that it's going to be something that is going to have this kind of impact on life? I don't know, but I make a lot of notes and I write things down, and I hope that one day it will stay in the family and somebody will look at it and go, oh my gosh, this is it. Have you stumbled on anything like that?
So it's kind of like, if all of us on the show here, when your laptop dies or your computer dies, what do
Yeah.
you do with it? I don't want to throw it out because someday somebody may pry this thing open and manage to start it
Yes.
up and find a masterpiece. So the answer is I haven't, but one thing recently was found. So obviously Bram has two direct descendants still alive, his great grandsons. They have
Mhm.
stuff.
Oh,
They're the
wow.
ones that allowed me to come over when I was starting my research to do my writing for Dracula the Undead. That's where I
Mhm.
found the journal. So,
Yeah.
Lisa, this journal, the handwriting is so terrible that even his great grandsons couldn't care less about it because it wasn't for public
Oh,
consumption, right?
yeah.
It was just,
Yeah.
and Bram was just keeping track of thoughts, ideas that he wanted to use in
Sure.
oratory, in stories, in poetry. There's some poetry.
Oh,
So
wow.
finding that was incredible, but I was also under a time crunch because I was there to look for things, and I wasn't about to just take it with me, and they weren't going to give it to me. But luckily, one of the guys, my cousin's daughter, was a professional photographer, so she said it's going to take me a while because there's like 311 different entries. I'll
Oh,
photograph them
wow.
all high res and send them to you via email. So this was like 10 years ago. So, email was very even slow back in those days.
Oh, yeah.
So to get 311 pictures sent over one at a time, this is
Oh
before
my
transfer.
gosh.
I'll never forget sitting here in South Carolina when it started coming in, and my wife was here like, oh, send it to my computer. Well, I don't know. I can't do that right now because I got to put it
Yeah.
on disk and hand it to you. And I'd already contacted Elizabeth Miller in Toronto, who's no longer living. She's an expert who helped decipher the Dracula notes. But it's stuff like that. And I'm going to give you one example that we found that was really, really eerie.
Mhm.
And then we'll get back to a letter that I was able to actually buy at auction, because that's mostly
Oh,
where I
oh,
find
yeah.
things.
Oh,
But
cool.
so one of the things that was in this journal was fire at Delaney's,
Mhm.
only servant's hand in coffin at funeral.
Oh, wow.
Fire at Delaney's, only servant's hand in coffin at funeral. So it's
Mhm.
like, oh my God,
Ew.
I've got something dark and spooky, coffin,
Yeah.
hand, there's got to be Dracula connection
Yeah.
here.
Right.
And there wasn't, but this is what we found. And this is a really
Mhm.
good example of, when you go down a rabbit hole on
Yes.
one of 311 different entries, to then write a footnote or something about it in this, in the publication. So it turns out that, and my wife is really good at this, when Bram was at Trinity College, where he was at that time because of the dates,
Mm-hmm.
one of his classmates was a young guy, William Delaney. The
Mm-hmm.
Delaney family in Dublin were quite wealthy, and they owned a taxidermy store, which was huge in those days because people dressed up with furs and feathers, of course.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
you had to cure them and then sell them and store them. And the chemicals used in that process were very volatile, very
Mm-hmm.
flammable. Of course, all the buildings were, 85% wood.
Yeah.
So the ground floor of Delaney's was a taxidermy store. And like many other people, they lived in the top 2 floors above it. So it was 3 stories big buildings in downtown Dublin. And a fire started. And so what my wife was able to dig out was a newspaper account of the fire. And it turned out that the father and the son, so dad and Bram's classmate from Trinity, were out for a walk, as they do. The wife, the daughter, and the servant were at home. And when the fire started, they were upstairs in the home, of course.
Yes.
And what would they do was they went up to the next floor higher to get away from the flames. Everybody started gathering outside.
Mm-hmm.
And what the newspaper article said was this was the first time that the brand new extension ladders were in use with the Dublin Fire Brigade. So along
Oh, okay.
the horses pulling the fire wagon,
Mm-hmm.
pumping things, and then along comes another horses and carriage with the ladders. So everybody down below, oh, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. The ladders will be here. Because what
Yeah.
people would have done with no ladders is they'd
Right.
figure out, do I go on a ledge and do we crawl along the side of the building and get to safety? Do we go on the roof and try to precariously get away? No, the ladders are coming. The ladders are coming. So they were waiting for the ladders to come. And what happened is when they put up the new extension ladders, they put them up to their maximum height, and the fireman went up and the whole thing collapsed.
Oh
So
my gosh.
the ladders didn't work. It was a
Mhm.
major scandal because, when the public outfit like the fire brigade, they invest all this money, but they fall apart in the first time they're supposed to be used. And sure enough, these poor people all died. The fire was so intense because all the chemicals, the only thing found was the servant's hand that went into the
Wow.
coffin at the funeral.
Mhm.
So that was the take home, and that was the explanation of the entry. And Jenny found the newspaper article saying, what a public inquiry had to be taken because of the failure of these things. And this was Bram writing this down just so he had a memory of this horrible thing that happened, but maybe that he could use it at some time in a story. And that's kind of a
Yes.
trend that he had in all these little entries that
Mhm.
they were sometimes horrific, sometimes very funny, sometimes ironic. A lot of times it was also mistreatment of women because,
Mhm.
back in the days, the men would get drunk all the time and come back and beat women, which is a horrible thing, and their kids. So he was really upset about that. You could tell that
Yeah.
these were things that it really bothered him. So
Yeah.
those are the little nuggets. And then when I see that and I'm able to say, okay, I've got to characterize Bram in a story, this is the type of guy he is because he
Right.
notices these things. So finding that was huge.
Yeah.
Very
And think about that, the imagery that we have of, Dracula coming out of his casket. It's very much like that, where there's just that, that dead hand kind of, hanging out of the casket, or like, there are some, I'll have to think about the original, but I know there's some movies where like, the casket get kind of
That's
cocked
right.
on its side and the
And the
hand
hand,
comes
yeah.
out. Yeah. There's always that one imagery of that hand sticking out of the casket, and it's that tension builder. It's that, oh my God, moment. So
What
having that,
lies beneath?
written down,
Yeah.
having that written down is fantastic, because I do the same thing, and I'm sure you do too. As an author, you see or hear something, you're like, oh, I need to write
I
this
gotta
down.
use it.
It's in
I
your
gotta use
head, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
For
use that
sure.
somewhere. Who knows when, but I can use it.
Exactly.
So the last thing, I'll just quickly say this. Most of the stuff that I have to acquire, because I've already gone through my cousin's stuff, they
Mhm.
have given and they have sold to Trinity College and other places that are really trying to put collections together. And I
Sure.
have to say, it's not a bad thing, when I think, oh, my family's selling
No.
stuff. But
Yeah.
what's important is when collections, raise money to go and bring things that are out there and bring them together in one place so that researchers like all of us on this call right here, this podcast, can say, oh, where do I go? Well, you're in America right now, folks. You can go to Emory University in Atlanta. It has the largest collection of Bram Stoker material anywhere in the world, because my good friend John Moore, who was a massive collector in Dublin, sold this a few years ago to the Rose Library, and it is incredible. It's it's like 10 times more than Trinity has, and it's nice that a private guy and my cousins want to say, we want to make this available to people,
right?
And the only thing that's holding back any of us getting access to it today is digitization is not inexpensive. So we have to go there in person. I guess, Pixie, you've been there?
I'm in Atlanta.
Yeah, she lives there.
Well, now I know where she's going next week.
Right?
Oh, check it out.
From Emory, too.
Oh, good.
Oh, so
how
jealous.
awesome.
Yeah.
So the thing is, people have sort of, this maybe a bad taste in their mouth for the fact that, oh, they're selling something. But listen, not only is digitizing things not inexpensive, but taking care of things the proper way, right?
Yeah.
So that it is around for years to come, is really important. And that's the point of having museums and having it so that, it does teach us what was going on, and having a collection of this all together for something that, and we'll touch on this even more, something that has become, and not just iconic, but it has, it has had such a influence on modern horror as well. So, being able to look back at that, just like, being able to look back at Mary Shelley or, anything like that, just having this collection and knowing that we, have such reverence for it, I think is important. I think it really is.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And you touched on something else, care of this stuff. For instance,
Exactly.
this journal was sitting in an attic. It was
Right.
beginning to decompose and moldiness. But when it goes to places like Emory and Trinity and London Library and the British Museum, temperature controlled, humidity controlled,
Right.
people come and look at it, the white glove treatment.
Exactly.
So that's another really good reason, even if, if you sell it to them, they're going to care for it and take care of it and make it available worldwide.
Exactly. And
Definitely.
exactly, just that reverence and taking care of it, like you said, white glove treatment. And how cool is that to know that, everywhere in the world, people are coming to see this because it was that important. And so I want to ask you something, kind of just segueing off of that, is I know that you've been asked this a lot, like how it feels to be part of the Stoker family and writing about that. But what I'm curious is how it's formed your writing and how it's formed where you went with it, because this wasn't your initial plan. This wasn't your, like, I'm going to grow up and be this, right?
No,
So how,
not at all.
you kind of stumbled into it and you're like, wait, maybe I do want to do this. So there's that whole journey there, but knowing that you took this on and knowing that it's a heavy responsibility. I think when you first started, probably didn't think of it like that, right? It was just kind of something fun. But now, as you're getting more into it and you're collecting all these things, it's becoming, I feel like, you are, the curator now, and you're also bringing in more family members who are still around and just saying like, hey, this is pretty important.
Yeah, you're right. When I started, it was essentially to get a better understanding of who my great-grandfather was, Bram's youngest brother, and that morphed into Bram. And it kind of hovered there for a while, like, oh, this is interesting. And I've got this uncle in Montreal who sends me stuff by fax. And what happens to that kind of paper just rolls up and disintegrates.
Yep.
And, but Jenny and I thought, okay, nobody else in the family is really doing the family tree beyond, their own household. So we got into it a little bit, but that was all. It wasn't international at that point, Lisa. It wasn't, looking beyond and sort of being the guy that I've turned into is like, who do you turn to in the world if you want an unbiased opinion? Because I haven't written a biography. I'm not trying to sell the biography. Therefore, I have some nonfictions to sell as well as fictions, but I want to try to be unbiased and truthful about who Bram Stoker was and who other members of the family and how their relationships were, so people can get an accurate portrayal. And then it took on another higher level. Funnily enough, when I started writing fiction, first with Ian Holt and Alex Gallant, and then with J.D. Barker, and now I got 3 other books in the works with different people. I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder because, and it's almost over now, but it's not ever going to be over. Is he just out here to capitalize on the name, or is he a producer? And I've always been in my life, and when you and I first met, and you and Donelle asked me, like, what's it like growing up? It's like, well, it was no big deal because my dad always said, you got to make your own name for yourself. That's the way we are. I don't care if you're, the son of this or a daughter of this, a movie star, or a football player or a hockey player. You got to make the name for yourself. And I was, as a student, as an aspiring Olympic athlete, then as a coach. It didn't matter. The stopwatch tells you, so there's no resting on any laurels. And the same thing sort of happened when I wrote the first book. It's like, oh, he's just trying to capitalize on the name. But I'll tell you this, I learned a lesson with, early on the first round of trying to shop the book, Dracula the Undead. Publisher said, this will get you in the door, your name. But if the material isn't better than average, then we know people are going to try to bring you down and are going to jump all over you. So it's going to have to be better than the normal guy that walks in here with a submission. So I then started holding myself to a higher standard. I was careful of what I said, careful what I post on social media. When I go to places at conventions, careful what I say, because I know that I'm being judged, and I should be, because Bram Stoker set a very high standard for himself as a person, as a manager of Henry Irving, as an author, as a family man, and so therefore I've got to be not just there but above that. So people aren't going to then judge me harshly and try to bring me down a peg. So that's a reason why I connect with a guy like Chris McCauley, who is as upstanding and very creative, and we also have a very good understanding of what should and should not be used in a story. Yes, we like to keep things fun and a little bit edgy, but we know we're not also going to take huge big risks, because people will think, oh, there they go, they're trying to be promote Bram's legacy, but they're just trying to sell a book. So that's a constant thing, Lisa, and I take it seriously, and I enjoy it, because that's kind of the natural way for me to do things. And it has affected not just the writing, who I write with, and how I present myself. And I will tell you this: my first non-vampire book is in the works with John Polisano, a fellow member of the Horror Writers Association.
He's my mentor. That's awesome.
That's fantastic.
And we hit it off years ago, and this is a story that we're writing that Bram Stoker could have written.
Sure.
In other words, the way it is personal experience. Now it's modern day, and it's in Alaska, and it's some weird shit that happened to me when I was on a fly fishing trip up there, and very vulnerable with everything going on. So it is a horror thriller. With no vampires and no supernatural, but I really think, I'm so excited that it's in the theme and spirit of Bram, but I'm branching off a little bit from supernatural, just to show that I've learned something in the 10 or 12 years of doing this, and I can stand on my own feet.
Right.
As a result of being mentored by Bram, by following his career and all his notes and everything else.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have 2 mentors. I have John Palisano and Jeff Brown. And John Palisano was my first when I first joined the Horror Writers Association. So I'm so excited, because not only is he a fantastic writer, but he's just a all-around good guy. Like you said, you're trying to get the good guys, and I'm glad you got him. But also, I would pose the question to somebody who wanted to say, oh, well, he's, just trying to make a name off. It's your name, first of all, but who else? I would say, who else would the family trust but somebody who is family to not only have these things, but to portray who Bram is, because it's not about just his story. You're bringing us the story of who Bram himself is,
Yeah.
and you're talking about, you know, the real person behind it. And that's what I loved about what you wrote, because we get to not just see where his mind was going with the story, but Bram himself. So that was, to me, like my favorite part about this whole thing was kind of taking a step back in time and really getting to know him, and you getting to know your family as well. So that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
So I want to go on to a little bit more, because I do know you have so much more here that you gave me to talk about. And again, we probably talked about a lot of this before, but this is a new chapter, so I really want to get into it and update everything that we were going through. But Bram traveled a lot, and I think that this is important, because this is also something that not a lot of people get to do these days, but it's so important. If you can travel, you should travel. And I know that you've traveled a lot. You are going to the places that he went, but you're also getting involved with the communities there, because Romania kind of got a weird a weirdness from it, right? Everybody goes there and expects to have, you know, Dracula, but there's so much more to Romania and the people there, and you really bridged a big gap with them. So do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my first time there was about 10 or 12 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
it was, you know, with a friend of mine, Hans de Roos, to go and kind of sniff it out and see what this country is like. That
Sure.
influenced Bram, and you know, at that time I'd only seen one or two books that Bram was aware of,
Mm-hmm.
and a map. So we had some things to go and try to look at it from the lens of what did Bram know, and let's turn it into
Mm-hmm.
reality, and you know, then just really get an idea of what the country's about. And in a nutshell, because we could go on for hours, it's a a country that just converted from communism in 1989,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still in the process of, you know, it's in the EU, but it's still uh, very socialistic and very bureaucratic, much like a communist country would be, and yet independent spirit from younger people, sort of the under 40 people, are really
Mm-hmm.
trying to bust out of their seams, which is really cool. A lot of high tech people, great education that's helping them rise
Yeah.
up. But you still have, uh, even though you've got big cities like Bucharest and Cluj-Napoca and Sibiu, they've all got historical elements to them. But you know, you've got a lot of traffic, a lot of pollution in some of the big ones. But you get outside the cities, and it's like you step back 2 and 3, 4, 500 years
Mm-hmm.
into these really cool UNESCO uh, designated walled citadels. You know, the castles. You know, this area was not bombed much, with the exception of the very north part of the country where they had oil fields during the World
Mm-hmm.
Wars. So
Yeah.
you've got really well preserved castles. EU money is coming in because tourism is huge there. It's still inexpensive. People still love North Americans over there. You know, we're not
Yes.
pariahs. The food is great. It's not that expensive.
Mm-hmm.
They've got this massive mountain range called the Carpathians, which is a big L-shaped mountain. So they've got like not quite the Alps, but they've got a lot of snowfall. That means they've got a lot of snow melt. That means they've got great natural irrigation. So they've got really good farms, the breadbasket of Europe, as then Prince Charles would point out. Now King Charles, he's actually purchased homes over there that he renovates
Mm-hmm.
and rents out, because he wants to show sustainability in tourism.
Yeah.
But it's really wonderful. The natural environment there outside the cities is wonderful, and the infrastructure. Other than the trains and the roads, you know, the airports are good, but train service is slow, not super predictable, and in a way, and every time I go, there's another section of what we would call an interstate, you know, a highway. But a lot of the roads going through all these mountains are one lane one way, one lane the other, and the only place where they have an extra lane is when you go around a hill and back. So
Yeah.
it's slow going,
Yeah.
but if you know, people are pretty laid back about it, you know, you just have to, you know, as we do it with the tour company I work with, you calculate those extra, you know, an hour and a half on a regular hour drive in case of traffic or construction. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
so what? You know, we're not there to. The life is not fast,
Yeah.
but the life is genuine and people really want to talk. And, you don't have a ton of television channels, but they do have, the internet, obviously. So
Right.
there's music and there's culture, and
Yes.
people still love to sit around in cafes and chat and pubs and have a beer and meet people. So it's a wonderful place to go. But I hate to tell you, there's not a bunch of vampires floating around. The Simpsons,
Yeah.
are you have to search them out a little bit
Mhm.
to find them. And when I do go with people, Dracula enthusiasts, I bring a copy of Dracula, I bring a copy of the notes, and I have these little handouts to say, guys, this is where Bram Stoker placed Jonathan Harker. He went here.
Mhm.
This is the feeling that he got from the books. We're going to get that feeling of what Bram wrote about. This is where Vlad the Impaler came from. Bram knew about it in the book, but this is where it is in real life, and he moved him over here. Let's go look at this place. Let's go look at the location Bram put in his book for the fictional castle. Why did he do it? Because it's a fiction. It's an actual volcano.
Right.
So we can make the story. It's not quite like Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons, where you could stand in the same place at the same fountain. But
Yes.
you pretty much get that idea. There are places, like in certain towns, that the owners know, and I've checked on the records, that this was the hotel very close to the train station where Bram looked in the Baedeker guide, and that's where he placed Jonathan Harker to spend the night before he got on the carriage and went into Borgo Pass.
Right.
So some of that is true. Other is fictionalized, and we just have to use good creativity, like all of us on this podcast have, to give you the good feel for it.
Donelle, you have a question?
Okay, so on that same tack, the castle itself, Bran Castle, which I'm sorry, not sorry. Vlad Dracula never lived there. They do think he was maybe held prisoner there, but it was actually a queen's castle. Started out. The whole history of it is just fascinating because it was a stronghold, and then a queen saw it and she loved it, and she had her castle built there. And I got to go there. And the interesting thing is, I talked to some of the people in Bran when I was visiting, and man, I would love to go back. And they were saying that every time tourists would come, they'd be like, "Oh, Dracula's castle." They're like, "No, it's not. It's this queen's castle. He was never here." They finally gave up and decided to start. They were doing the tours. They're like, if tourists want to say that's what it is, okay, we'll make some money for our village. But we've talked about it before, but for our new audience members and for Pixie, how did he go about choosing that castle, and why is it everybody now recognizes it and says, "Oh, that's Dracula's castle from the book"?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I do recall us chatting, and I know you've been there, so you'll get it. But for the sake of everybody, and I was just there now, it's like 2 weeks ago, we actually launched a product that I'm very proud to be a part of, Stoker Wines. We actually purchased a vineyard south of there.
Do they ship?
We're gonna circle back on that because I'm really excited about that too.
Do they ship?
Private party there on October the 28th. And I did get up and declare in front of the 120 guests. I said, look, this is why this is on our label, Bran Castle. This is why Uncle Bram used this as his castle Dracula, not the location. But the two of these books that I was talking to Lisa about a little earlier, one by Charles Bonner and the other by Elizabeth Maciucelli, had sketches of Bran Castle, then known as Castle of Toursburg. That was its name at the time, in these books. Of all those 26 books that Philip found in the library, and they're all the 26 ones listed in his notes, only 2 books had any castles in them, and it was by Bonner and Maciucelli, and it was these castles. So I am, there's my circumstantial evidence that it's the only castles in these books. Yeah, maybe he had something else that told him about this. But when you add the factor, Donelle, that Bram was an artist, he was actually a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. I have some of his sketches. I can only imagine that Bram was looking at this book and then the other book, doing his research, and he goes, "Ooh, I got to use that as I'm
Mm.
describing the exterior
Right.
of my fictional castle." And
Yeah.
there is 2 places in the novel where he described it. And I do this all the time. I have a picture with me of both castles. I read the description to the people present, and I say, "You tell me, does this not look exactly the way Bram was describing it? You know, it's
Yeah.
on 3
Right.
walls, they're on these big rock and blah, blah, blah." So that makes total sense. The fact that Vlad the Impaler may or may not have ever even visited the place is not, it's inconsequential, because
Right.
Bram only took him for his name, meaning the
Yeah.
devil, and moved him from Wallachia up to Transylvania. But in Bram's notes, when it's cross-referenced, this lines of longitude and latitude to the 2 maps in these different books, it places the castle about 400 miles to the northeast,
Right.
not very far from Bistrica, which he mentions in the story as a stopping off point for Harker, and the
Right.
Borgo Pass, which is mentioned in this map, the actual words in English, Borgo Pass. And then you can see Mount Israel at the intersection point of 25 3/4 and 47, and it happens to be an extinct volcano, which
Mm.
is so everything falls into place. And that's why Donelle already knows this, but that's
Yep.
why the people down there and the castle folks, who have now become good friends of mine because they trust me and they've used this now in their PR, that's why it's Castle Dracula, not the Vlad connection. He's got plenty other castles around the place, Pronari Fortress, Targovista, and also in Bucharest. This one is Queen Marie's beautiful
Yes.
summer palace, but it's the one Bram used to describe the exterior. Funnily enough, the interior of his fictional castle is exactly the same as the interior of Slane's castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram actually wrote the novel. And
Makes sense.
it's got the exact same layout with the very unique octagonal room that he mentioned when Jonathan Harker comes in with the count and puts his bags down, walks through one hall into an octagonal room with no windows to the outside, lit by a single lamp.
Yeah.
And that single lamp, by the way, when I gave this one of my lectures in Cruden Bay to the town, this guy in the back stood up and said, "My name is Robert Hay. My family used to own Slane's Castle.
Wow.
I own that single lamp."
Oh.
So when his family
Nice.
sold out, and this is what happens to earls, 500 year succession in these things, when the bottom fell out of the grain market after World War II and international travel by ship for grain changed the dynamic of the prices of grain, all these earls who had these earldoms and were counting on all these essentially slaves who were living on their lands selling grain, they lost everything. And so they were stripping out the lead from the roofs, the paneling, the upholsteries, the lamps. And then when they took the roofs off, they didn't have to pay taxes on the ruins of their castles, so they could at least own the land that it was on. So Slane's Castle now, if you Google it, and you should, Slane's Castle, Cruden Bay, Scotland, you'll see drone footage, an octagonal room. That's the one in Dracula. So Bram merged the 2 castles together, placed it on a volcano in the Kalamani National Park.
Yeah. And that's what we do as authors and as artists. We just, draw inspiration. We draw what we've seen and what we know. So it makes a lot of sense. And he was obviously very, very inspired by all that, which again, we find things and we get inspired by them and we write about them. So I want to ask you, what do you think in today, modern times, what defines a monster? And how do you think Bram would explore that concept if it were something he was doing now?
Ooh, that's a good one. What today's world? What is a monster? I mean, I don't want to get political, so I won't. But you know where I could be going with this. Some political being or mob characters or rogue military groups that do horrible atrocities to people and don't care about human values and all this stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's what I'm looking at. Like there is the supernatural, but I tend to sort of look at things, through that lens of what's scarier to me is reality that we can't
Yes.
control, things that
Yeah.
spin out of control, and good human beings trying to get on with their life are subjected to terrorism. That's another monster.
Mm.
Horrible treatment of people. Those are monsters. And you got to call upon your resources and your energy to survive around that stuff. So,
Mhm.
what would he be doing? I mean, it's hard to say. He might be looking into uh, folklore.
Mhm.
I go to cryptid type conventions. The Mothman and all these Bigfoot and these things. They're mythical kind of creatures. We're looking for evidence. Vampires were kind of that way back in the time. People thought they
Right.
were potentially real in certain places. We're looking for evidence. We want proof. Spiritualism was something we were thinking about. Science couldn't prove it, yet people were open-minded, and that. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's something he might maybe he would cross some kind of a crazy ass politician with some kind of creature out in the wild, and have. I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm getting off track, but you guys ever watched that series Lost years ago?
Yes. Mhm.
For a
That
bit.
Yeah.
that was spooky to me because you're out there vulnerable. You didn't know what this power source was, and as the seasons went on, they got closer and closer, but they never could quite figure out what that powerful force was, and weird stuff was happening.
Mhm.
Uh, I like that because it wasn't something you could wrap your hands around already and say, okay,
Sure.
yeah, it's a Bigfoot. We just got to figure out how to trap him and then shoot him
Yeah.
with whatever weapons we got.
Mhm.
That didn't happen, with
Yeah.
that. So I think Stephen King's onto some cool stuff with out there things that we can't quite wrap our hands around, but we know
Yes.
they could be real and they're
Mm-hmm.
affecting us.
Yeah. And I feel like modern day now, I don't know if you've seen the show From, that kind of does the same thing. It's very
Okay.
reminiscent of that. And then of course Josh Mallerman's Bird Box, where you couldn't see,
Ah,
I love
right?
that.
Like you
yes,
couldn't see what was going
yes,
on, and that was so brilliant to me. Like I love that kind of horror because I think that's that's where Bram was coming from, right? And I want
yeah,
to circle back to that, the blood is the life, because as a child, there was bloodletting because he was ill. So
yeah.
back then, I'm sure that with he was a very scientific man. He's very analytical, and there's still things beyond us that we don't quite understand, and that can be very scary, especially for
Mm-hmm.
him as a child too, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, he had three brothers. My great grandfather being one of them. Were very advanced scientists. George Stoker invented ozone therapy.
Hmm.
Thornley Stoker, his older brother, who helped him with Dracula, did brain surgery on people before it was that. And one of his uncles was the one that I'm sure bloodlet him. So
Hmm.
you just triggered another thought. That's why, Pixie, when you read this book, you'll love it. But the scenes with the leeches,
Yeah.
Hmm.
sucking blood from Bram, JD came up with some really cool and horrific, cringing type stuff for that. Once I gave him all the facts, he like went with it. But that's horrifying. Can you imagine, like, if there was, you normally trust the doctor, right? You have
Yep.
to because they're
Yes,
higher,
right.
right? So the vulnerability when a guy comes along to either cut you or leech you, that was a feeling that I think we got in Dracula. That feeling of you have no control over this. Now you are subjected to this horrible torture, which is in the name of medicine, but you can't
Right.
refute it. You just got to go with it and how horrifying and
Yeah.
painful it is.
Mhm. I mean, medical to me is, I mean, I was very sickly as a child. So medical to me, it does show up in mine. I'm pretty, I love Dracula, but I also love Frankenstein. And to me, it's
Yes,
because of
yes,
the medical fear. And, it is so life and death. and the control, like you said, his uncle, or was it his uncle that had that was a brain surgeon? Can
Yeah.
you imagine back then, coming up with, and I think we had talked about this before, coming up with things like that? You're touching into things that we had no idea what these things would even do. And when, opened up a body, we thought the soul was in there and things like
Yes.
that. So having
Yeah.
the bravery to go in there and say, I'm gonna do this. Again, where vampires come from, they didn't know if that if they buried them, if they were coming back, if there was a demon or what. So, for me, having that control and having that power in the medical field was both scary and awe all at the same time. So
Yeah.
the influence of both of them, both Frankenstein and Dracula, not only was horror, but again, it was coming to modern medical. So like for Frankenstein, we now have um, transplants. For
Mhm.
And
vampires,
cloning.
we
Yeah.
have, and we have resuscitated people back from the dead. So it's fascinating how they all kind of touch against one another and inspire, like science fiction, right?
Yep. Yep.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm. So if you could add a new character or twist to Dracula's story, one that reflects today's fears or cultural issues, what would you add or change? Now, I'm asking this as somebody who has not read your books, not as somebody who has. So for readers who have not read your books, I know that there are some, new characters and everything, but if you were to take the original Dracula and sort of, create your own character to fit into that world, it's yours. What kind of character would that be?
Uh, you know, I have because because you said it's got to be mine. I really like, and I'm cheating a little bit, but when I look at Bram's notes, he had 3 pages of people he was planning to write in the novel.
Mhm.
Detective Cotford became a real favorite of mine because I've done some volunteering with sheriff's office and search and rescue and all this. So I sort of like that, the good policeman is trying to do his job. So I
Mhm.
can't use him because even though he wasn't used in the novel, I used him with Ian Holt in Dracula the Undead. But there's a one that wasn't used, and Chris and I are dabbling with this guy. Alfred
Okay.
Singleton is somebody who Bram was thinking about. So it's not totally my original idea, got to give credit there, but a
Mhm.
psychic research agent was what
Oh,
Bram
okay.
was thinking of including.
Huh.
Now, I've done a lot of research since the two of us have talked last about Bram's interest in sort of parapsychology, second sight,
Mhm.
and there's a lot more there than we have time for tonight, maybe
Sure.
another time. But now I know why he was thinking of including this guy in there is
Mhm.
wouldn't it be interesting to have that ability to have second sight and be able to use that in research and now I look at people and I've seen short stories on psychic detectives and all that stuff and
Mhm.
it's not that unusual now, but back then it was. And
Right.
I think it would be cool if you have a character in the novel Dracula that is struggling with, and it is one of the band of heroes that they utilize
Mhm.
to have some sort of psychic powers to combat the psychic connection that Dracula has with Mina and vice versa. That
Mhm.
sort of saves, how can we stop Mina from getting abused of the mental takeover by Dracula when
Right.
they have the blood exchange and
Mhm.
protect that, or use it to help the band of heroes to find out exactly where Dracula is. And that's another level of power, isn't it? Because Dracula has
Mhm.
powers, but he also has psychic connection when there's blood exchange. But what about
Yeah.
when there wasn't? Is
Right.
that so? That's I've been dabbling with that thought process and thinking of including that in another story. So that's what the first thing that comes to mind, Lisa. And I do know this. I've had access to the list of books that was in Bram's library that was sold by his widow.
No,
2 years
okay.
after
Oh,
he
wow.
died. So I know he had a couple of books in there. One of them was a book about second sight that he reviewed professionally for a
Nice.
newspaper in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read the review, and he doesn't like put it down. He doesn't say, "Oh, this is a
Yeah.
lot of." It's like he takes it very seriously. And I've
Yeah.
also found a newspaper article in Dundee, Scotland, about an interview a guy had with Bram, and he wrote about his experience meeting Bram at a cocktail party for Henry Irving, but he had much more interest in Bram Stoker, who
Mm-hmm.
talked about his experiences with second sight.
Wow.
And it wasn't, just to sell a newspaper. It was real.
Right.
So I'm still, I'm still riding the Bram train, but
Sure.
something that he didn't have a chance to exploit, I'm now pulling out and finishing it
Yeah.
or using it myself.
Because seances were a big deal back then. I mean, people
Yeah,
were really into that. And like, it wasn't just like something that people did, like, hey, wouldn't this be fun? Like, prominent people took it very seriously. And it
yeah.
was, you had to pay big money for it, and they had private parties and things like that. So, very interesting. I am looking forward to seeing where you go with that. But before we run out of time, I do want to go on to some things that you are doing on your own. So please do tell us more about the wine and the cheese. Is it your son who's doing it? Who started
No,
it, or
no. My
no?
son actually he's one of the guys. He's got his PhD in English literature, actually a couple of months away from finishing the dissertation. But he's come with me to Scotland,
Okay.
Ireland, England, Romania. He climbed the
Oh,
mountain with me.
wow.
Oh,
We
boy.
had an
Amazing.
interesting adventure.
What wonderful memories.
So
That
he's
is.
going to be picking up the torch when I'm done with it. But on
Okay.
one of my tours recently, a couple of years ago, there was a lady who used to work with Goldman Sachs, Kay Larkin. She was, she had retired from that, and she was looking for something else to do. She was a Boston College student under Ray McNally, who wrote all about In Search of Dracula. So she had Dracula in her blood. But she liked to drink wine like the rest of us do. We went on a
Yep.
wine tour as well as Dracula and looking at bear reserves and so on,
Sure.
preserves. And we were there, and there was this Forbes magazine on the table at the vineyard, and it was like, hey, Romania is the next place. Italians and French, where the land is getting gobbled up for development and global climate change, and Romania is the next place. And
Mhm.
they're buying up the old vineyards. And we found, when she pulled me over and said, look at this stuff, that Romania is like the 5th biggest producer of wine in Europe, but they haven't been exporting any of it because of communism. It was all to feed their own people,
Oh,
and they
okay.
didn't have the wherewithal to
Right.
export it. So there was a lot of this
Okay.
going on, and I don't know, Donelle, if you drank any when you're over there, but it's very good wine.
It
They've
is.
got
They do.
excellent soil, yeah,
Yep. They do a good
and,
job.
Mm.
and they've got different regions. They got white wine in certain regions. They've got red. They've got rosé. I mean, so it's a big country, and they've got all the right type of soil and aquifers,
Mhm.
acidity, and all the rest stuff you need. It just hasn't made its way out of the country. And so she
Right.
put an investor group together along with myself, and we bought this thing just about 10 months ago. It was an
Oh,
existing
congrats.
vineyard, Michael
Yeah.
Rottenberg Wines. Michael Rottenberg was getting tired of the thing in his early 80s. He wanted to sell it
Mhm.
to, he wanted to sell it to Americans so it could go out of the country. Some people that
Yeah.
had money, he thought it was the right thing. So a group of us got together, and we've rebranded it as Stoker Wines,
I
wine that
love it.
tells a story. We've got
Yes.
a artist in England, Graham Humphreys, who has done 5 labels for us.
Mhm.
We are working. We've moved all the existing wine we purchased into different vineyards in our area of Cheptura, which is just outside of Bucharest, because our
Mhm.
facility, which is 1 story above ground and 2 below, is having a complete renovation done to turn it into a
Oh.
really proper wine tasting experience,
Oh,
with
beautiful.
Nice.
videos and where you can pair with food. And while we were doing all this, one of the guys the remaining guys at the vineyard said, I've got a brother-in-law who's got a cheese business, and we got all this extra wine that's very highly fermented. It's very sweet. It would be really good if we can infuse it with his cheese.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that
Oh,
sounds like a
God.
good idea. We've all had port infused wine, a cheese,
Mhm.
haven't we? It's good.
Yeah. Yes.
So we then bought 30% of that company and rebranding that as Stoker Cheese. So as I was just over there doing the launch of it, we actually launched Stoker Cheese as well at the Dracula Film Festival in Brasov.
Mhm.
And we're now working diligently with our lawyers to get the right trademarks, to get right Food and Drug Administration approvals, to go into Ireland next year, London, England, and then the U.S. shortly thereafter. Because it's you can't just pick up and send bottles of wine somewhere. You got to have proper launching efforts. You got to
Sure.
be in certain stores. You got to have presence in certain locations. And this is not going to be huge. This is a small boutique wines,
Yes.
100,000 bottles at a time, not, a million bottles, not mass produced stuff, but it's going to be middle of the road, not cheap table wine in the $6 to $8 range. It's going to be more sort of that, $15 to $45 bottles of wine,
Mhm.
but, Cabernets, Merlots, Rosés. We don't grow grapes that will make white wine right now, but there are lots of people that do. And what often happens is you sell your grapes, they need more of yours,
Right.
you need some of theirs, and then you bottle it and then you package it and you tell the story. So yeah, that's what it's a cool learning experience. But
Yeah.
the other fun thing, just to cap this one, is we talked about Bram Stoker being bloodlet. And one of the things
Yes.
they did to kids, anybody, when you're bloodlet, is you take out enough blood until they pass out. That's how you
Mhm.
know you've taken enough blood. And you
Yeah.
rehydrate them by giving them red
Wine.
wine with the alcohol to cleanse, right?
Yes.
So we joke about, well, Uncle Bram, developed a good taste for red wine during his early days of bloodletting. The
Yes.
blood is the life,
Yeah.
but wine is even better.
Yes.
That's my
Exactly.
tagline.
Yeah.
Blood is the life, but wine makes it go better. So
That's right.
that's what we're going with, and hopefully that'll bring us great success. And it's really nice to
Yeah.
also to say Dracula may have been the #1 export from the Stoker family starting in 1897, but Stoker Wines is going to be the next great export from the Stoker
Yes.
family starting in
Nice.
2025.
I have a
Yeah.
suggestion. Add in chocolate.
Oh.
Oh,
Oh
Chocolate.
yes.
that's such a good
European.
pairing, isn't it? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
I
yeah.
will
No,
be all over that like a
yeah.
fleas on a dog.
Chocolate, wine, and cheese. Oh my God, let's have a party right now. That's
Oh
it.
God, yes, yes.
That's like
So
heaven.
I'm hoping that okay, it's already up, but you've launched it. It's going, and you're renovating that
Renovating
area.
now. People can go to
Okay.
stokerwines.com now, see our
Yeah.
website. And there'll be more on that all the time. We've got a Facebook page, an Instagram page.
Hmm.
I post and I will be reposting soon some of the really cool labels. So
Yes.
Dacre Stoker author, go to follow me on Facebook and you can see some
Hmm.
of the, I'll be telling that story along and along.
Yes, and you can sign up for information like a newsletter for the wines because I've already
Yeah.
done that. I'm already there.
I'm behind.
So yeah,
I'm behind.
you're behind. But
I need to get
I do
on
want to
that.
thank you so much for your time here. I don't want you to leave without talking about anything else that you want us to go look at. Like, you have your social medias. Tell us about that. Tell us about anything else that we haven't touched on today, because I want to make sure that everybody knows that it's not just Dacre Stoker is doing this, but you're a teacher. You love the environment, so you've done a lot of things with that. You're an executive director, right, for some environmental things there.
Yeah,
You
Aiken
have
Street
a
State.
huge
Yeah.
facet of things. So
So
tell us
yeah,
everything.
well, I can't tell you everything. We'll be here all night, but
Exactly. Yeah.
We could do a part two.
let's do part 2 sometime. We'll get into the
Perfect.
non-Dracula stuff, but here's what you
Yes.
can look at. Because look, Chris is off cheering up kids in Alberta, Canada. The Stokerverse or Stokerverse.com is our website that shows all these really cool games, and it's unbelievable what Chris has had access to. We've got a handheld video game coming out. We've got a card game that the prototypes are out.
Oh, the card game.
And
Sorry.
that they will be out very soon. Dice
Yes.
game coming out soon. Lots more news in that Stokerverse. So go to stokerverse.com, also on Facebook. I do Facebook and post all about that, as does Chris, Dacre Stoker author. And yeah, just follow the Stokerverse and follow Stoker Wines. When we're here, we'll be having lots of cool events to celebrate that. And then my tours,
Yes.
experience-transylvania.com, talk about the tours. We got a really cool one in May with a group of students from Charlotte, North Carolina. And then I'm going to be doing another one for the general public right after that. So late May, early June. Yeah, those are the big things to push right now. But yeah, let's have another one where we talk about some of the other stuff in my life.
I would love to do that, because there's so much that I'd like to hear about you, as far as, just teaching, because you are a teacher, you are an educator. So I do want to learn a lot more about you outside of the vampire stuff. So we will do a part 2. For those of you who are still with us, we are going to stay tuned. We'll be doing some 500 words from Dacre. We'll do a poem by Chris McCauley, who will be read by Pixie Bruner. And then we'll also do another reading of either Dacre or Chris. You'll have to stay tuned to find out. So thank you so much again. I really appreciate you. Have a great night, everyone.
All right,
Thank you, Dacre. Have a good
Bye-bye
night.
now. See you, Donelle.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.